Start recording. We are now live. Okay. So again, stay current with the assignments. Yes, obviously it's the 21st century. I accept late assignments. I mean, if I didn't, half of you would fail. Especially right now, just because there's so much going on and it messes your schedules up. And I've been having interesting conversations lately with people one of my neighbors came over and banged on my door and she was all happy because she's fully vaccinated now so she can shop. She went over to shopping cart and she was like, I went to shopping cart like all by myself, and it was great, like she had to think about it. She hadn't been in shopping cart for like 14 months or something. And I'm like, that's really good. That's very good. And you just keep doing that because now I don't have to anymore. So that was kind of nice. But anyway, yeah, people are getting all messed up. I think it's harder to remember what day it is. Like I say, I've said this before, I've got a whiteboard over there on my refrigerator and I have to write the night before. Tomorrow, Bill, you have this class or these classes, you have these meetings, you're meeting with these students, you have these things to do. And I have to do that every day. If I don't, hell, I'll just read books and play board games, play guitar really loud and annoy my neighbors, which I should do anyway, these damn people with their vaccines and everything. I got to get my second shot tomorrow, so I'm probably going to be feeling like shit by the time class rolls around.
Yeah.
I'm using shit as a social science term, of course.
Of course.
All right. We've got four things to talk, four these writings to talk about. I don't think we're going to have, if I can ever shut up, I don't think we're going to have that much trouble getting through all four of them today. Assuming that we do, though, and I think we will, you just had an assignment due. Okay, by the way, the grades are posted now. I had to reread a couple and I got one late. I'm still waiting on a couple, but I thought, well, I'm going to post the grades anyway. I've decided that instead of having the assignment due, and it normally would be due on Sunday, I pushed the date back to Wednesday, the 19th, okay? Because it just seems like having just finished an assignment for a lot of you, it's like, I'm sure that absolutely the next thing you want to do is crank out another one. So I'm going to make that visible for you right now. And this is a slightly different assignment. Look at the description, because what I'm asking you to do is what's sometimes called a critical summary, okay? And take any two of these articles. And normally this assignment used to require that you integrate all four into a single assignment. Then seems mean right now, so I'm not going to do that. But what I want you to do is identify for each of the two articles. You can even make it two separate little pieces, like a page on one and a page on another. You're not compelled to tie them together or anything. This is an important kind of exercise, though, where you identify, okay, what's the key thesis of each of the readings? What do the authors think is most important? And then how do they build that argument, right? What are the supporting elements of the thesis? What kind of evidence do they give you? Do they offer possible alternative explanations that they then outweigh with the strength of their own argument and evidence? Or are they just making a singular claim without really trying to compare it to anything else, all right? So for want of a better term, I refer to that as a critical summary. It's more than just a summary because you're critiquing it. A lot of times when you hear the word critical, I think people assume that you're being negative. It doesn't mean that. It means that you're giving a critical eye to it. You're looking at it in terms of its intrinsic merits, its intrinsic logic, the structure of its argumentation, things like that. None of that implies anything negative, okay? So take a look at that. I think we'll be able to get done today with all four of them because they're really fairly simple structural arguments. I don't think any one of them is particularly subtle. They're kind of telling you right away, here's the argument. All right, so let's start with that. We'll just take it more or less in order. The first is this discussion of the degree to which religion and terrorism are or are not, linked causally. Does religion lead to acts of terror or whatever? So let's do that one first.
Okay. Hello. Okay. Sorry. Ooh. Whew. Okay. So terror.
You have plenty of time. Okay. Take your time.
I don't think that helps much, but thank you anyway. Okay. So terror and religion. I'm going to assume I'm saying his name right, by Mark Juergensberger. Correct me if I'm wrong, but yes. So
You're talking about the author, Juergensmeyer. Juergensmeyer, yeah.
Okay, thank you. So the main concept in this article is the question, is religion in bed with terrorism? Is it the problem or the victim? One of the main factors used in this article is the September 11 attack, where researchers use that as a starting point about whether religion's role in violence is the key. So this article talks about how a certain religion, Islam, is said to be the problem. After September 11, it said that Islam is behind the attack and has supported acts of terrorism. So many try to explain the politics of Islam and how they relate to terrorism. So most people believe that Islam's relationship with politics is the reason behind religious violence. But the article uses other examples such as Judaism and their kingship anointed by God, Hinduism and their kings that hold the divine order, and Christianity with their merging lines between state and church. So there are extremist groups in the United States that uses violence as a way of portraying their Christian theocracy. From the bombings of abortion clinics to shooting up a gay bar, it is said that there have been more bombings on US soil in the last 15 years by American groups than Muslim ones. And all of them are said to be Christian. Yet despite all the facts given, America still publicly labels Islam as a terrorist religion. The article also shows a different side of things, those who deny that religious is the problem. So there's an extreme discussion over religion after September 11, where people believe that religion was and still is a victim. It is said that when religion enters an equation, the innocence behind it is exploited by politicians. So many mainstream religious leaders explain that the actions of groups are not encouraged by religious motives because they do not represent normative traditions. So Duke scholar Bruce Lawrence, the author of Shattering the Myth, explains fundamentalism that is applied to a host of religious traditions and is another way of excusing normal religion to a twisted form. He explains the spread of a different breed of religion that has been twisted into its own kind of form of violence. The idea of Islam and fundamentalism is so linked that when talked about, it has become a bigger picture of damning Islam and its branch of religion. So the question is, who is right? Is religion only an innocent victim that is misused by small extremist groups? Or is religion a problem in itself, one that leads to violence? So such a simple question with no answer. So it's hard to answer a question that could go both ways, with facts to back up both sides of the concept. So this article gives out a conclusion on its own, where the answer to these questions are open-ended. They go both ways, both right and both wrong. So the answer given here has been backed up by a series of case studies and interviews over several years. So Juergensmeyer, throughout the years, has done his research and has concluded that every religious tradition in the world has been connected to an attack at some point. So Juergensmeyer then explains that religion is not the problem, but it is still the outlet of issues that become worldly problematic. He talks about how religion provides comfort to those who seek retribution spiritually and is a way of forming bonds with those of the same mindset. It gives moral justification during a political encounter. The war on terrorism, which was launched by the US after September 11, deeply scarred the US and their way of going about things. So the role of religion here that was talked about in the article is that it was and still is a problematic partner of political confrontation. It brings more conflict through its justification for violence. On the other hand, a positive outlook that was also shown here in the article about the war on terrorism, on religion is that it can offer peaceful resolutions and a respect for the dignity of all life. The article then says the solution to religious violence is not more violence, but more religion. That we should truly understand the concept of religion before putting it into action. Otherwise, it could go both ways. So Juergensmeyer used throughout the entire article, he then explains how he got to all the information. You know, he was studying in India. He was looking really deep into the political views and how religion connected straight to politics. And I think that was one of the biggest issues here in this concept or in the article that was given.
All right, any questions? Does Does Juergensmeyer answer the question?
He does, but it's like an open-ended thing. That's the thing. Like,
Well, if
he
it's
said,
open-ended, then he doesn't answer the question,
yeah.
does
So
he?
one of the things, yeah, that's true. You know what? That's probably right. Yeah. So he says he has an answer, but he doesn't. If that makes sense.
Well, but does he? I mean, is he right, for example, when he suggests at one point toward the end of the article that the solution isn't more violence, but more religion? Because, for example, okay, um, it's not just a question of whether or not religion causes violence. That's the question misstated. We talked about this in the first module. Remember when we were talking about whether or not there was a new terrorism, and the argument in favor of that among its various elements suggested that part of the newness of this terrorism we're seeing in the late 20th and early 21st century is its peculiarly religious nature. But when we when we looked at that in terms of broader historical scope, we saw that religion has really, at least as often as not, been associated with terrorism. See, one of the things that Juergensmeyer doesn't do here is, rather than say which religions have been associated with terrorism, which is pretty much all of them, what he doesn't do, I'm going to suggest, he doesn't identify significant acts of terrorist violence that didn't involve religion. And as a social scientist, such as whatever the hell that means, my training immediately screams at me, you're sampling on the dependent variable. That's what it's called. In other words, you're only looking at cases where the thing happens that you're trying to explain. And in order for you to be able to explain that thing, you have to use examples of similar kinds of case where that thing isn't present. In this case, the connection between religion and violence. I mean, Simone nails it on a number of fronts here. You took a very complex, kind of sprawling argument and kind of tied it up neatly, I thought. But it is that idea of, yeah, I mean, it's not at all uncommon to find even the most apparently pacific religion tied into acts of violence. I mean, most people would be stunned to hear that, there are Buddhist terrorists, but yeah, what a shock. Yeah, there are. So in other words, I'm going to suggest it's an interesting article. It gets us thinking, but where does it lead us? Where does it take us? And Simone suggests, well, it leaves the question open. That's not that that's a bad thing. Maybe it's not, maybe it can't be answered, but what I'm suggesting is the problem may be the reason why Juergensmeyer couldn't come up with a more definitive answer is that Juergensmeyer is either asking the wrong question or framing the right question in the wrong way. Does that make sense? Now, what I just did is a critical analysis. In other words, I didn't dismiss him and say he's wrong. Okay, what I'm doing is saying, okay, here's what he does well. He lines out this history. And Simone, you did that work. I didn't have to do that. But, he has this approach, this conceptual approach to looking at religion and violence and terrorism. Okay. But methodologically, he doesn't necessarily complete the circuit for us. He doesn't give us a systematic analysis of non-religious motivations for terrorism. Okay. For example, is it accurate to say of the Oklahoma City bombing that that was motivated by religion? Because if you look at the things that Timothy McVeigh wrote, and even though Terry Nichols worked with him on that, it was pretty much McVeigh driving the incident and making it happen. Okay, I don't see that having much of anything to do with religion. The fact of his Christianity does not make that a religious expression of violence, does it?
No.
But you see, Juergensmeyer doesn't help us, and Simone, this is not your fault. You pointed it out. You can only work with what you're given, right? He invokes Timothy McVeigh at one point. Well, the Bible, he even says the Turner Diaries were his Bible. Bad choice of words. Okay. Because the Turner Diaries, other than being hallucinogenic nonsense, do have this sort of smattering of a weird kind of millennial, kind of Revelations Christianity, ultimate apocalyptic war vibe to them. Every major religion has that baked into it somewhere, or certainly the three desert religions have it. Judaism, Islam, Christianity. They all have that sort of apocalyptic notion of a day of reckoning or a day of judgment or some nonsense like that, right? Why, I don't know, other than, one of the explanations is it's because they're not religions of life, they're religions of death. And the only thing they promise is a better afterlife. That neither of those three religions gives you much to go on to have a meaningfully, significantly, substantively improved life. They're all about what waits for you after you die. Okay. Well, if that's the case, then let's get on with it. That's the problem with those religions at the fundamentalist level. See, Juergensmeyer could have gone into that and explained the importance is not religion, but fundamentalism. He kind of trips over it a little bit, doesn't he? I mean, he sort of talks about fundamentalism, but he doesn't identify that as kind of the jumping off point. It's why, for example, I included this article on honor and terrorism that we're going to get to in a minute, right? And it's that idea, well, why do people commit violence? Most people are uncomfortable saying, unless they're atheists, are uncomfortable saying religion makes people violent. That seems like a silly argument. So if that's the question he's asking, I would suggest he's asking the wrong question. We know that religion doesn't make people violent. We know that it's deep in us instinctually to be incredibly violent and explosive and detonating animals, especially when we're in a pack. Okay, that's why we survived, because we're dangerous. Okay, there's nothing more dangerous than a destructive animal working with other destructive animals and being smart. That's about as dangerous as you can get. The next most dangerous thing would be one of those destructive animals who's smart, working alone, who is indifferent to the quality of life of the rest of the animals. A psychopath, a sociopath, whatever. Okay. Why do we want more religion when clearly the world is moving, at least the industrialized world, the so-called West, is moving away from religion? It's secularizing. For example, in the United States, when you look at people who identify as Jewish in the United States, I'll get you in 1 second, Rachel. When you look at people who identify as Jewish in the United States, your generation of American Jews, right, is far less likely, first of all, to identify with any religion. Okay, that's important. Okay, but also, when you look at Israel right now and what's going on with Israel, is that a consequence of religion? Is it really that it's Islam and Judaism that are the collision points, or is it just a turf war? Because those are very different explanations. And I don't think Juergensmeyer helps us much with that. Rachel, what were you going to ask or say?
Yeah, I was going to say, well, first of all, I don't know, I had some issues with this article and the way that it was written. I don't feel like it was presented very well, but I think especially the end in which the author specifically was the problem, to combat violence, we don't need more violence, we need more religion. But I feel like what is instead, what it should be is not more religion per se, but more religious, more religious education is what the author kind of was hinting towards, but didn't say.
Yeah.
So I feel like it's really easy to misinterpret the point of the author's article because of the way that they wrote it.
Okay. Now, Simone, you presented, so you know this article right now better than anybody, maybe except for me. Do you think that's a fair criticism, that the vagueness of the article is in part an artifact of the inability of the author to be clearer about what the actual point is? I mean, part one critique is you're asking the wrong question, pal. Another one is maybe you're asking the right question, but I don't understand what the hell you're trying to say.
Yeah, so I think throughout this entire article, from the beginning to when I read the ending, so he was trying to explain it, and yeah, it was pretty vague. In the end, he kind of had an answer, but he wasn't really specific about it. So I think he could have had an opportunity throughout the entire article to explain which part, or at least which side he was on, or at least give us an opportunity to give us a side that we could actually choose from. But since he only explained one side of things, didn't really hint at anything else, it was kind of like a conflict of interest. He had opportunities to explain maybe a different point of view, but it was.
Maybe, yeah, that's an interesting observation that runs parallel to, I think, what Rachel's complaint is look, you had a lot of chances to make a point here, and you could have given us a fresh perspective on this, but you kind of bailed. You kind of punted. Professor Chapin, what were you going to say?
That's how I felt that he ended the article. The way that I understood it was that he asked two very particular questions at the very beginning of the article, and then essentially answered a different question with an interesting argument talking about religion as basically being a tool in mitigating these particular conflicts. And then how I felt he ended the article was, well, since religion is being used as a tool in a violent way, clearly it can be used as a tool in a helpful way, and then offered really no explanation for how that would look, but was just kind of like, well, if it can be used in the bad way, clearly it can be used in the good way because it's just a tool.
One of the responses to the sort of instrumentalist argument of religion would be, no, you're using the wrong analogy. It's not a tool. And in other words, if you want to build a house, you got to have a hammer, okay? What you don't want is fire, okay? And so if you want to build a house with fire, negotiate with religion. I mean, I could argue that, and I could argue that in a compelling way, I think, that no, it's not a tool, it's an obstacle. Because I could argue, for example, and for those of you who are believing in any religious faith, I'm not coming after you. I'm saying if I wanted to do what Simone says we should do and just carve out a clear position so at least you'd know what my point was, here's what I could say. Religion is the opiate, not of the masses, but of the ignorant. Okay, if you don't know how to make sense of the world, religion tells you, don't worry about it. Either there's nothing you can do about it, or do these 3 or 4 things and don't worry about it. Okay, that's not dealing with the world. And it's not dealing with the things that are liable to cause the kind of frustration and rage and discontent that are going to lead to violence. If all along you're just, well, it's God's will. Well, then it's God's will that I shoot the fuck out of you in social science terms, right? I mean, you can use religion to justify anything, can't you? Of course you can. So it's not a tool. It's a fuel with which you can burn things. Now see, that's an extreme position, right? That's a pretty extreme position. Notwithstanding the F-bomb, that's an extreme position. Okay. I once had an article rejected for publication because I dropped 2 F-bombs in it. One of them, I used a term that I really liked, and I'm going to say it, okay, because it's elegant, okay? I referred to political hacks as ideological sport fuckers, because the idea was you don't really care about any of this. You're just trying to get laid at parties, And it was part of it. It was a chapter in a book. The woman who I talked to couldn't stop laughing because she knew it was right. She said, "We can't print this." And I said, "Why not? You're laughing. That's the point of it. Social science should be funny, But what I'm saying is, what she couldn't reject was that I had a coherent position. Okay. So that the trap that Juergensmeyer appears to have fallen into is, you know what? I'm going to do what religion claims to do. I'm going to give you a non-response response. I'm not going to really tell you what you need to do to deal with violence. I'm going to be Solomon and split the baby. well, you could, you know, you do this and then you do this and it works out. And maybe if you had more of this, you'd have less of this. And yeah, but maybe you wouldn't, pal. You know, that was my reaction to the article. Now you might wonder, well, then Bill, why did you assign it? Because this is an interesting conversation. And I'm watching the way you're reacting to this, and I can see it's like you're either getting pissed off, you're tired of me dropping F-bombs, or you're thinking, yeah, Juergensmeyer, man, you had a chance. We could have learned from you. And we didn't. You turd. You know, or whatever we want to do. You know, I mean, we could do that. I thought that was a good start for us, though. There was a lot of substance to. I think there was more substance, in a way, to Simone's summary and analysis of that argument than there was to the argument itself. So well done, well done. Can we move on, or do we have anything else to say about, you know, Professor Juergensmeyer and his insipid lack of argument? All right, then let's move on. Well done. The rhetoric of Islamofascism, this one is much subtler. This might be the one that's got some stuff we can stumble over. So we'll, you know, everybody feel free to jump in on this one if you want to. But you want to go ahead and start with that, Camille?
Am I frozen?
You are. You could, if you're worried about bandwidth, you can kill your video if it becomes a problem. You know.
Yeah, sorry about that, but you guys.
No, that's no problem. As long as we can hear you, that's cool.
Okay. Okay. The ideological basis of the war on terrorism is embodied in the discourse of Islamofascism. The war on terrorism was said to represent a competition between two fundamentally different versions of social life. On one side, the members of the Islamic movement are who are said to embody the regressive values of tribal or closed society, while the other side is the United States or other Western nations.
Can I stop you for just a second? You're actually reading from the article.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't want you to do that.
Okay.
We can all do that. What I want you to do is just jump in and tell us as succinctly as possible. Okay, here are the main points.
Okay, the main points are there are two different versions of a society that clashes, and that's what created the war on terrorism. The number one thing that they focused on was also what happened in 9/11 and how they believed it could have been handled. On one side, let's see. On one side, it is like more conservative, and the other side is more open and tolerant. But even though they say that, like, the United States said that they were more tolerant and open, they still chose to do what they did based off of what happened in 9/11. And the Islamic countries thought that it could have been handled in a different way. I kind of just tried to grasp the highlights of the article.
Okay,
And then
let me help you a little bit. There's a key argument to hear based on the writings of this guy, Karl Popper. Fascinating name, right? I'm so glad I'm not named Karl Popper. Even though I think I kind of look like a Karl Popper. But it's this idea of, Popper was writing about fascism, totalitarianism, all the absolutist, authoritarian kinds of states and super states that were growing in the midst of and immediately after the Second World War. And he was appalled by all of this. Popper was a kind of free market conservative in this sense, very much a kind of, not a reactionary, but relatively conservative and individualistic, rational choice kind of thinker. And so he had this model that the authors, that Hibbert argues, informs the notion of Islamofascism, which was the tension that exists, that characterizes the major flashpoints in the world between closed societies and open societies, right?
Mm-hmm.
That
Yes.
and so, like the Nazis were a closed society. The United States was purported to be an open society. So the idea was that the tension that existed and that the architects of the rhetoric of Islamofascism would have us believe still exists is what it was then. It's between open societies like the United States and most of the West and closed societies like these Islamic fundamentalist organizations that are trying to create a pan-Islamic caliphate, or in other words, they want to create and expand territorially a closed society, right?
Yes.
Okay, so I guess what I'm wondering is, first of all, Hibbert doesn't buy this. He rejects it. Okay. He doesn't argue, for example, that the Islamic world was up in arms with the United States response to 9/11. Okay. In fact, at least initially, until we really started, kicking ass and taking names or whatever the hell we were doing, we had a lot of support from most of the Islamic world. Okay. There was a lot of outrage and a lot of shock about, oh no, that's not possible. People could not have taken our culture and our religion and weaponized them in that way against civilian targets. That's just wrong. There was widespread rejection of that, including, in much of the Islamic world, and particularly, of course, in South Asia and the Middle East. Okay. But the other version, and I think this might be where you started to get a little bit confused, but you're not completely wrong. There was another interpretation of that, and it really came out more the longer that we stayed, when we, not only when we invaded, and we did, not only when we invaded Afghanistan, but more obviously when we invaded and occupied Iraq. And it was the idea that, wait a minute, you don't understand why these people did to you what they did. We're not saying it was right, but you're ignoring their motivations. And by the way, it wasn't religion. Okay. It was territorial, and it was existential. You're intruding on us globally with your supposedly open society. You're not allowing us to live the way we want to live.
And that's the geopolitics, right?
Yeah, exactly. So geopolitics from this point of view is not about open and closed societies and fascism and freedom, okay? It's about globalization. It's about US foreign policy at the barrel of a gun, but also US foreign policy using films and television and music and all these things that really torch, traditional values with or without religion. Right. One of the things about the Taliban, it's more than just religion. It's a way to kind of turn the clock back 500 years. The idea being, no, leave us alone. I mean, the steady mantra of Afghanistan for at least the last 200 years, if not much longer, has been Europe, the so-called open societies, leave us alone. Get out of here and leave us alone. If you don't, we'll kill you, or you'll have to kill us. Okay, that's not so much fascism. In other words, there's no real desire within Afghanistan to take Afghan culture and export it to the rest of the world, or secure, world dominion, centered in Kabul or something. That's nonsense, because that's fascism. Fascism is about super states. Okay, the states in the Islamic world are, for the most part, weak states, and none of them is expansionist. So the idea is the fascism rhetoric is what you pointed out initially. It's ideological. It's a way to galvanize American opposition to any argument that militants or insurgents or terrorists might have, that they have legitimate grievances. That would allow you, for example, to condemn the violence and yet say, you know what, we did bring some of this on ourselves. So it absolves the United States, and Britain in particular, of any responsibility at all. And it assumes, well, we were just nice people and they're being mean to us because they hate us for our values. We know that most of the Islamic world does not hate us for our values. I mean, part of it is that there are a lot of people who don't like the crassness and the shallowness and the belligerence of Americans, okay? You don't have to be in the Middle East or South Asia. You don't have to be a Muslim not to like America. But there's a real difference between thinking, man, these people don't have any culture, and thinking we should annihilate them by riding planes into their buildings and terrorizing them.
Yeah.
Okay. So the idea is the Islamofascism argument is an ideological construct with very little to support it. It's no more real than is the smoke and mirrors nonsense of Donald Trump having won the election. It's every bit as fictional. Okay, and it's also at least as damaging because it doesn't allow for us to look at what really happened and what's really happened and try and explain it, not justify it, but explain it.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh
So
my
let me
gosh,
ask-
I feel like
sorry, go ahead. I didn't
I feel like you did that, and can I have another try with a different article, because I feel like you kind of did that even though I was supposed to, which obviously because I did it incorrectly. But is there any way that this cannot count for me and I can do another one?
Well, what I would suggest that you do is, I think you probably have a better understanding of the article now than
Yeah.
you did initially. Why don't you just write your paper?
Okay. All right.
Just write the paper.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I mean, I remember I said before we started this one, okay, this one's a little tricky. It takes a certain grasp of history. It takes a certain connection with critiques about ideology and all that. So no, I mean, you did the best you could. This is the one article I would suggest in this module that was kind of a tough go. Okay. And I think what happened was that, understandably, I think you got a little bit tied up in what for you might have appeared to be a kind of fast and loose, barfing out of a word salad of phrases and things that didn't make a lot of sense.
Mhm.
That's perfectly understandable. My main interest is that you get to the point where, okay, now I understand it. In which case I'm thinking, good, then just write about it and tell me that you understand it.
Okay.
That would be fine. I mean, yeah, some of these presentations kind of give themselves, some of them, like this one, I had made notes thinking, okay, this one's going to be the tough one. I'm trying to rethink. I don't see my notes. Oh yeah, take time with rhetoric because in quotes, ideology. I think a lot of us now study it when we try to study this stuff. We bounce off of this notion of what ideology is. A lot of students I've noticed will use the word ideology when they mean something really different. They'll use the word ideology instead of the word idea, or they use the word ideology instead of perspective. Okay, an ideology is not merely a perspective. It actually is an artifact of the kind of closed society that Popper critiqued. And this, Pramahana, I think this is why you got confused. It's like, well, shit, that sounds like a closed society. That's not what the author's saying. That's right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense generally to the class? That the dilemma of the Islamofascism explanation is it's not an explanation at all. It's an ideological justification that closes down subsequent debate. And so what it starts to sound like is an artifact of a closed rather than an open society. And if you were an adult trying to explain 9/11 right after 9/11, as I was, you realized you now live in a closed society. Okay. I mean, really, I've mentioned this before, but I always find it kind of funny that I actually, I went on a relatively conservative talk radio station in Medford, KMED, when they used to do political talk. I don't think they do anymore, but I was brought in there ostensibly to discuss 9/11. This was right after it happened. Okay. And the first thing I said was, with all due respect, this is not Pearl Harbor. Okay, it's not. Pearl Harbor was an attack on a military installation by a country that was being relentlessly provoked into a confrontation with us because we wanted control of the Pacific. It was a very different kind of thing. Not to justify it, but to explain it. And I went historically through, all of the presence of European powers, European colonialism in the Middle East, the Suez Crisis, and all that. I tried to explain that there was this long history of the United States and Great Britain aligning themselves with brutal, authoritarian, anti-democratic, harsh regimes in the Middle East. And as a consequence of that, a lot of people hated us. And by the time I got home, there were on my phone at work, right, which it records the number from which you call and it time and date stamps it. I had like 8 or 10 calls, 2 of which I swear to God were death threats.
Wow.
You know? So it's, I mean, not only is that extremely country Western, I mean, it's like, come on, don't you know? I got your phone number. I felt like calling this one guy back and just saying, hey, Slim, just so you know, I now know where you live. You know? In other words, they totally missed the point. They didn't scare me. It was like, oh, closed society, fundamentalism, ideological fundamentalism. Okay. So that's why this article can be confusing, is because, and you know, Hibbert knows this. He's trying to explain to you, this is the contradiction of that perspective. The very insistence upon an ideological explanation closes debate rather than opening it out the way an open, tolerant, liberal, small L liberal society would. Okay. It's anti-liberal to paper over something with an ideological explanation that is ahistorical, that just doesn't fit the facts. But that's exactly what the Bush administration did. And indeed, the Democrats bought into it. A lot of people, that whole, they hate us for our values, they hate us for our freedom. That's nonsense. It's complete nonsense. Okay. First of all, most of the rest of the world kind of, you know, they're kind of annoyed by us, but they don't hate us enough to want to harm us. You know, there's a buddy of mine who is a really, really good musician. And he grew up in East Germany before the unification. He's like, he's a few years younger than me. To this day, he still says, I miss the GDR. I miss German socialism. I miss the idea. He said, I know, you know, there were things about it I didn't like, but when I come to this country, at least I can say we had culture, we had life, and I don't feel like you have. And he knew it was like, I'm just getting, you know, German socialism from him. But it really got me thinking, yeah, of course, if you grew up in a relatively closed society like that, and you're a decent human being, and he is, in addition to being a really good musician, I mean, yeah, you might miss that sense of security. He said, I never knew poverty, you know, and he lived in rural areas and he lived in big cities. And he said, nobody was rich, but I never knew poverty. That degradation of the spirit that only poverty can provide, right? He said, we did functionally eliminate that, but there was always this concern about US intervention. And, you know, he said the United States was at least as responsible for the wall as was Germany or the Soviet Union. That's a compelling argument that I could refute. But you see how, even coming from a closed society, he could open that argument up and we could debate it, we could discuss it. If you get into the idea of this rhetoric of Islamofascism, is it just closes down debate. Okay? Any questions on that? We're doing pretty good for time. Okay, but yeah, by the way, in any of these, if you feel like, you know, I did this presentation, I didn't think it was that good, you can shoot me an email and ask me, hey, you know what, could I go ahead and write the paper? I didn't feel like I really brought it on that. And I'll either tell you, don't worry about it, you did fine, or I'll say, yeah, you know, you got off to a slow start. Why don't you just go ahead and write the paper? I don't care. You know, you try, that's all you can do. Some of these things are hard. All right, honor and terrorism. This is, again, what we're, you know, sort of the theme for the day here is the notion of honor is in part, according to this article, and according to Shandrick, it's a cultural construct, the notion of honor and an honor society. Okay, so tell me about this argument for honor and terrorism. What is it? Cultural origins of the severity of terrorist attacks.
Yep, by Joshua Chantrette. So the big thing that we're getting out of this article is that the author is looking to question the hypothesis that cultures of honor, which we'll get into in a second, produce more deadly terrorist attacks. Basically, the number of fatalities increases in societies that have a heavy emphasis on honor. And when the author talks about honor societies or cultures of honor or honor cultures, he's talking about societies in which perceived slights against your reputation or honor you respond to violently. So it's legitimized violence based on insult, basically. So the idea is, I'm a very manly man. Someone insults my integrity or my honor or my word or something. I'm forced to respond violently, or other people will believe that I can be taken advantage And the author argues that these are built in some places where there is either a high competition for resources or a lack of authority or a combination of both of them. So in the author's example, they use the American South as the quintessential honor society, which you can argue with or refute if you would so choose. But the American South in his eyes is the quintessential honor society, in that basis of being assaulted personally with words or something means you must respond violently to prove that you're going to, I guess, hold back or prevent people from taking advantage of you. And the whole purpose of this article is trying to explain why terrorist attacks have a fat tail on them for fatality distributions. The idea is that there are a kind of regular distribution and then an increased uptake at the very end in higher fatality attacks that you would not expect out of a traditional bell curve or normal distribution, which would say that you could prevent more deadly terrorist attacks and do better counterterrorism if you could pick out which ones would be more violent to begin with. Major issues with the article. The only one that I really came across was that one of the base points is that he tries to explain that honor culture makes people more violent and doesn't spend a lot of time picking out other parts of the pie. So there's a brief section in there where the only quote he has for as to why honor cultures are more likely to commit homicide is a study from 1971, which is like the right beginning of his data set too. So I don't think the author does a good job of picking honor cultures and making them the explanation for why those places are more violent than others. For example, the American South is more impoverished. It's the poorest part of the country. I think that there's probably a strong correlation between being impoverished and violence in general, right? But I don't think the author does a good job of refuting that or explaining why it's the honor culture and not the poverty or anything else causing it. The author ultimately concludes that honor societies are more likely to have violent terrorist attacks, and the data definitely shows it as well, that like the American South, the attacks there are more likely to be more fatal than other places, and then extrapolates that to other honor societies likely also have similar things. So we think of Islamic terrorists as being like honor societies with high fatality rate terrorist attacks. So the author kind of extrapolates and says that it likely explains part of that as well in the like analysis section at the end.
One of the things that's distinct here culturally is that, and this struck me, one of the reasons I used this article and thought it was interesting was just, you'd never hardly think religion, you know. This is a powerful cultural explanation, and yet it is most decidedly not religious.
Explicitly not religious too. There's that section where he says that, you know, Islam and universal religion spread far and wide, but these kind of honor cultures are normally very locally bound. So for example, the American South, right? American Christianity exists across the whole continent, or the whole geographical state, right?
Yeah.
But the American South is a very small region of that.
Now, what he didn't control for, and you're right, we're looking for the things he didn't include in his model. It's kind of like looking at Juergensmeyer's argument and thinking, well, gee, you could have done this and you could have done this. There isn't really a solid control in there for religion, because one of the things about the South is, yes, it is sort of per capita, you know, pretty much the poorest region, and also the largest geographically region of the country. Not the most populous necessarily. Well, it is now, but it is certainly, it contains some of the most grinding poverty. Right. It's also the least urbanized. Okay. It's also the least secular. And any one of those could be a compelling reason. When he defines honor cultures, and he has these two criteria. All right, this is on page 328. He says resources are easily stolen, and there is relative lawlessness due to limited state penetration. Read also rural. Okay, I mean, you want to find the most violent places per capita in Jackson County, go out into the sticks, because the response time for the sheriffs is 45 minutes. Hell, I could kill 15 people in that time and then have dinner. You know, I mean, you know, it's there. It's also much more of a weapons culture because of that. we find that it's much more common for people to, not exclusively, but the trend is that if you live in more rural areas, you're more likely to have firearms. Well, there's a very good reason for that. You have to defend yourself from animals that can come into your property and from other people.
Another thing I thought about, the effectiveness of law enforcement. It's much more difficult to effectively prevent terrorist attacks in smaller, less urban environments. For example, New York City can spend a significant amount of money, but maybe Oklahoma City is not as able to spend as much money, right? So it's one thing, the American South has a lot of not as large mega cities where these terrorist attacks have taken place.
That's right. Yeah.
So I don't know, but it was definitely one of those, like, there felt like there was a lot of variables and there's only 2 paragraphs or something dedicated to kind of refuting and trying to narrow down honor societies as being the main principle here.
All right. Remember when I was describing the assignment that I want you to do for this module? And I said, do a critical summary. What AJ just did is a critical summary. It was a good faith, honest broker summary of what the author is trying to, what the thesis is, and how the author goes about trying to demonstrate the thesis, with some critique thrown in of, well, you could have done this or you could have done this. It doesn't have to be comprehensive. What you're doing is, when you can critique that and say, yeah, but you didn't control for this, or what about this? You're telling me I understand this article well enough to be able to think, well, there could be another explanation. It could be this. Maybe it is religion. Maybe it is the fact of, it's not so much honor cultures, but it's cultures defined by self-reliance of necessity, because it's more rural and it's more impoverished, or it's more this, or it's more that. One thing he could have included that he didn't is the history of vendetta and feud that characterizes the history of the American South, that was inherited from Scotland and Ireland. Okay, people brought those sometimes decades or centuries old resentments and feuds that were clan-based and things like that. They brought them across the water with them, and in many cases kept them.
Yeah,
that notion that you used to hear as kids of like the Hatfields and McCoys and all that, that's what that's from. And he could have pointed out, for example, that there was a long history in the South, specifically of litigated honor killings. Well into the 20th century, for example, if you found that someone was having an affair with your wife, you could legally be justified in shooting them. Okay, that's an honor culture. So, I mean, I think there's something to his argument. I don't know. I think I'm with AJ. I don't know how much it actually explains, but I would suggest, yeah, there were things, as AJ points out, that he left out of the analysis. I think there's a lot he left out of the analysis that might even have strengthened the argument, though. There is a historical arc to the South culturally that does support that. It was much more common to fight duels later in history in the South than it was outside the South. That's honor culture, right? But don't get me wrong, AJ, that's a perfectly good summary. I'm not critiquing your summary. It's just that I think this is an interesting approach because it doesn't rely on religion and it doesn't rely on ideology. This isn't about politics. This is a cultural formation that is not intrinsically political.
Well, and I think he has good international examples as well. Like, he connects it a lot to Chechnya.
Yes.
And the vendetta killings there, and specifically just the indiscriminate retaliation strikes, right? Like a family member would lose someone to Russian intervention or invasion, and then would respond by either becoming a suicide bomber or joining a terrorist organization. Like, it's a very clear, like, you've slighted me in this way, I'm responding in this way. I especially thought the part about the international slights in the South was interesting to me. The idea that American Southern college students are more likely to respond to international slights against the US more aggressively than other college students.
Yep.
It's one of those, like, it says good example to me, but also possibly there's a lot of other variables playing with that. Like,
what would the other variables be?
Patriotism, family in the military, economic status.
Could patriotism not be an artifact of an honor culture?
It could be, but I don't know that it's explained by honor culture.
Okay, see, that's a fair critique, because what you're conceding is it could be, but he didn't really methodologically or conceptually link the two things together.
Yeah.
I mean, I could see a way to model that in which patriotism could manifest in more intense ways and more specific ways in an honor culture than outside of one. That the whole concept of love of country could mean very different things to different kinds of people, but not as an ideological construct. not as a Republican or Democrat or liberal or conservative, but in terms of the sense of self-reliance, and the flip side of self-reliance is personal slight, personal insult, personal damage done. That is, a slight against my country is a slight against me, and I take it personally. Whereas I think people following this model, people not living in these honor cultures, are more likely to abstract those things or try to explain them, even if they condemn them, as opposed to saying, no, we need to go put a boot up somebody's ass.
Right. I also thought it was interesting. He includes environmentalism as terrorism, but also notes specifically that the most non-violent / non-human life damaging, the least fatal terrorist attacks, is the way of saying that, were all the environmental terrorist attacks. So we talked about earlier in defining terrorism 2 weeks ago of it has to be meant to cause bodily harm in some way sometimes, right? You need to be trying to hurt someone. Most of the time it's not just property.
It can be considered an attack against persons or property, though.
Yeah.
If
if
the motive is to terrify people in order to pressure significant political outcomes.
Right. It's just interesting. That's in the same thing. And I think I don't know. I don't know if the data would look better if you looked at that more critically at your cases and split off some of the environmental stuff that weren't meant to be fatal for people, and looked at only intentional killings, I guess. But I don't know. Yeah,
but I think, again, it's an interesting approach. It's kind of like the Islamofascism model is an interesting approach. We don't expect any of these to be perfect, but it's important that we understand, okay, here's where this argument kind of flies.
Right.
Here are some questions, though, that I still have, because nobody here in these arguments, and certainly not me, is purporting to have all the answers, or, okay, there's a definitive explanation for this. But I think, well, for example, one of the things that we know historically, particularly if you just look at fatalities, but also if you look at actual bodily harm, by far the most dangerous, the most destructive, and the most lethal terrorism in the United States, by far, comes from people from the ideological right of center. By overwhelmingly. There is no debating that. Okay, notwithstanding what you will hear from people on right-wing talk radio or whatever, or people criticizing Black Lives Matter, when a riot goes south, is most of the demonstrations of Black Lives Matter, for example, while they were intense, the way demonstrations are supposed to be, pay attention to us, were not violent. Okay, and they look nothing like what we see with militia violence, or what we saw, early in the Trump administration in a number of places, usually in the South. So part of that is there is more of a culture of violence on the right historically in the United States. It doesn't mean that people on the left are not violent. That's nonsense.
Maybe murderous violence, right? Because there was the example in the article of the Communist Party in the South conflicting with the KKK. And the Communist Party beat them at a rally with clubs, and then in the next rally, the KKK showed up with assault rifles and got them down.
But you see my point. In other words, the most deadly is going to come historically. Right. First of all, where the hell do you find communists in the South?
Not anymore. This was the 60s.
Yeah, I mean, they shot them all, apparently.
Yeah, I think it was the early 70s or 60s is when that one happened.
I think it was late 60s, but but I can't, I'd have to look. Sorry, Rachel.
I was just going to say,
Rachel, yes, we know you're running for president.
I was just going to say, and correct me if I'm wrong, isn't it true that the violence from the right tends to be more like what AJ was saying, more like personal violence, and then the violence from the left tends to be more like property violence?
I would say structural violence. In other words, most of the time the left is attacking institutions rather than people. And that's why violence on the left has generally taken the form of, say, occupying buildings and some destruction of property and stuff like that. But there's been a significant reluctance on the part of most of the left in most of American history not to kill. The idea being that how can you argue that you are a progressive humanist if you're blowing people's brains out, Whereas the argument from the right is, I'm not a progressive humanist. I'm a radical traditionalist. Bang, I mean, it's, and then maybe justified by religion, or maybe justified by anti-communism, which became a kind of secular religion or whatever. But yeah, I mean, again, there was anarchist violence in the United States in the early part of the 20th century. There was labor violence. There was obviously violence against labor, but there was labor violence too. People who were beating, and sometimes beating to death, strikebreakers and people like that, or scabs, people who were crossing the picket lines. Yeah, you could stand at least to lose, a significant number of your teeth by doing that. So it wasn't that there was no violence. It was that it's much rarer on the left. And where it is, I think Rachel's right. It's more often, like the environmental violence is almost always targeted at property. Manifestations of capitalist materialism. Well, people are not manifestations of capitalist materialism. Their lives are shaped by it. But the manifestations of capitalist materialism are things like tax subsidized SUVs, and any item of luxury that serves no functional purpose other than look how rich I am. That's what a left-wing environmentalist is going to go after. Yeah. All right. But I think it's an interesting model. I do think we can critique it. We can critique any of these things, but I think for example, I think it gives us more to chew on than the terror and religion article.
Yeah, I think definitely it's like part of its whole analysis was we really haven't looked super closely at the connection between culture and regional culture and terrorist acts themselves.
Mm-hmm.
I think that part is spot on, right? Like when you're trying to explain terrorism, you can't leave out the kind of regional cultures that these places develop with, right? Like
he makes a compelling argument that you shouldn't.
Right.
Yeah. But he's also kind of conceding, look at this as a first cut at this. We need to do more of this. And I like that kind of research where people say, you know what, I think I'm onto something, but we need to do a lot more of this.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, he's kind of putting himself out there with this. This is a new strain. I'm taking this cultural theory part from over here and applying it, which I think was good. So I think overall the article was really good. It was just the follow through sometimes had a couple of questions for me.
Yeah, and I think that's just you being a good social scientist. I mean, that's you thinking, analytically rather than just, oh, that's a cool argument. I like it. All right. Any other comments or questions about that? Does everybody know that Rachel's running for president? Sorry, I'm just going to do that because I'm feeling contrary today. All right, here's one. Again, this is a little bit of a subtle one. There is a kind of easy generalist way to get at this, but there are nuances to it. It's another one of those arguments that it's compelling up to a certain point, and then it's like, well, how much does this really explain? In this notion of Islam and liberalism. This is a short one, though, so there's only so much that can be got, but it's surprisingly dense for all that it's short.
Yeah. So I hope I don't miss the subtlety, but we'll find out momentarily, won't we? So the theme of this article, or the point of this article, is it starts out saying, it would be great if we could take if we could take Islam out of ISIS. And the argument is that the article really talks about that there are a lot of assumptions that are made about the Islam religion that should not be made, and that we as Westerners or people from the United States don't know a lot about the religion of Islam, and that we should probably educate ourselves. It shows how there's a lot of stereotypes of the ultra conservative that are wrong, and there are stereotypes that Islam is highly conservative, and it gives us some great examples of how they're not highly conservative. But so let's go back to this. So Islam, the article says it's not fundamentally evil or violent. It's also not fundamentally conservative, but it is perceived that way. It says it has, like every religion, it has conservative and liberal branches. There are people inside Islam, the religion, who are fanatics and also apathetic, reactionaries, and revolutionaries. It talks about the fact that there are 73 sects. Well, it doesn't say it, but I looked it up. 73 sects of Islam, but we really only know like one or two. So we don't understand the concept at all to begin with. And we get in this rut of just equating every single thing we know to all of the religion when that's not really fair. It talks about that it gets into this, it gives us a bunch of examples of how the Middle East is not conservative. And although it's interesting, like for instance, there's the zakat tax, which basically takes 2.5% of everyone's income over a certain amount and uses that income to pay for the homeless and for services and for, you know, things like that. That's in Saudi Arabia. It talks about how Iran pays for transgender surgery, but then it has like a little asterisk that says this is how government considers a way to assign homosexuals their correct gender. So it kind of is a little bit more dark than, hey, we're doing a good thing. It kind of feels like this is done at gunpoint. The Jordanian government, they talk about, you know, how their parliament has requirements for specific amounts of people to be female or Christian minorities or Circassian and Chechen minority populations. And that's all good. Then it gets into this almost passed over concept of politics of religion. And it talks about how leaders like Muammar Gaddafi in Libya and President Ali in Tunisia bolster their claims of power by using their personal sect of Islam to oppress all other sects or religious groups within their countries. And the way they do this, the article says, is to create a minimal winning coalition. So they really want to like solidify power in as small a group as possible because they only have to share goods and power with that small group. And the leader can stay in power easier because he can manipulate this small group in an easier way. And it's easier to continue to get support from that small group of people. They say this is the way that they use religion to retain support for their oppressive regimes. And so I think that last paragraph is a lot to think about and almost the most important part of this article. But it kind of doesn't get around to the point until the very end. The other thing is, it's great to give us all these examples about how liberal these different countries can be, but we're glossing over the, you know, horrifying examples of how strictly conservative they can be. And maybe the author just sort of assumes that we know that already, that we already have that on auto dial in our head so that they don't have to talk about it. But I don't think it's fair to not give us any other examples. He just talks about human rights abuse or closed society or conservative society, which is a huge difference between, you know, you're not allowed if you're female to go to school or to drive or to be out without a male, you know, partner, all that kind of stuff. It kind of just skims the surface of that. So that's pretty, it's only one page, so that's pretty much what it's about, but.
Yeah, there is a lot there. I would suggest what's not there is the core of what should have been there. And that is the idea that is there a possibility that by definition, religion has a tendency to be illiberal, any religion, because the more deeply religious you are, the more closed is the society within which you live. I mean, it just seems to me to be inevitable. Religions are not about tolerance. Religions are about justifying certain kinds of behavior and condemning other kinds of behavior. I mean, every religion, pretty much, certainly the three major religions and certainly Christianity and Islam, have that baked in. The idea being, you know, the purpose here is to give you a code of conduct, to give you law. I mean, both Judaism and Christianity, and so by default, Islam, are essentially based on a book of law. Okay, it's why you will hear, even in Islam, people referred to as people of the book. The book isn't the Quran. The book ultimately is the Torah. It's the source of law. That's why there are so many similarities between Islam and Judaism. You know, and you know, Islam comes along a lot later, but it's amazing how portable those ideas are that now are seen as completely contradictory and incomprehensible one to another. But also, none of those ideas are liberal. None of them. In fact, the whole notion of the liberal notion of so-called religious tolerance, John Locke writing his letter on religious tolerance and insisting upon that, and other liberals, at least since the time of Locke, insisting that a core value of liberalism is tolerance. Never mind that, there are some wonderful responses to that. By the way, I just got a really fascinating book. I'm actually thinking of that my 371 class next year might focus on her writing. Wendy Brown is a super brilliant political philosopher and has written very fascinating critiques of liberalism. But if we're talking about liberalism, what we should be talking about is, not Islam, but our religion and liberalism in conflict. And that seems to me, that's sort of the subtlety of it, and you were kind of hinting at it. But the article focused, and so did you, on Islam, and that's fine. But I'm going to suggest we could pull back and broaden that scope and say, is this not characteristic of any religion? I'm asking the question by way of further conceptual and theoretical analysis. What is particularly liberal about Christianity?
Yeah.
I mean, where are the liberals in the Bible? Where's the tolerance in the Bible? Where's the tolerance in the notion of, the 12 tribes of Judea and the justified butchering of people in order to take back land? That doesn't sound tolerant to me, and that ain't Islam. Okay, that's Judaism and Christianity. What's liberal about Revelations? What's tolerant about the Pale Rider? You know what I'm saying? And again, it's not me shitting on religion. It's just me saying, let's be honest about this. To the extent, especially, and here also, I think this was missed in this article, and you implied it, Karen, in your summary, was it's not religion. It's when religion becomes politicized. When you're talking about a religious state, that's a really different thing than if you're talking about a nation state within which a religion or religions exist. Yeah. I'm sorry.
Yeah. One of the things the article says is that, the problem, it seems to infer, and maybe I'm wrong, that the problem that religious societies have is that they're trying to take a text from long ago and interpret it to today. And I think the problem is that they're trying to not interpret it for today's crowd, but enforce that text from long ago on today's society. It's like he's saying, oh, well, if we could just figure out how to adapt this old text to today's society, then we wouldn't have a problem. But the problem is that they're forcing an old text on today's society, and that's where the problem is. It's like getting the genie out of the bottle. You can't put it back in.
Well, it's the same argument in secular terms that you find with so-called constructionists interpreting the Constitution. We have to go with the framers' intent. Well, no, we don't. But also, even if we did, a lot of times what comes out from conservative critics has nothing to do at all with what for one thing, none of the framers intended that we have a theocracy. None of the framers intended that we have a society in which any religious doctrine was superior to the Constitution and the structure of law created by it. So it was created as a secular republic. Okay. But, we have plenty of people in the United States, which is not a Christian country, but a country in which Christians live and are the majority, let's say, right? That's different. But even there, we find people invoking religion in illiberal ways, right? Sorry, Pamela, go ahead.
That was something that came up for me reading pretty much all of the articles. This one in particular, the Islamofascist article in particular, and even the first one with religion, was just this idea, I feel that all of the authors were really trying to push, was very much that there's this just massive misunderstanding and misinterpretation in our own place in like the world. And by us meaning like the United States, like
right.
Thinking that we are a free country and that we are supporters of freedom and liberal values. And that's something that we hold true to ourselves. But that in practice, that's not really what we're seeing that we're doing, but we're attacking other people for not being these particular ways that we're not even. I don't know, that seemed to be kind of highlighted in each of these pieces, even subtly, that it was more of an attack at that.
Well, look at what's happening right now. And again, this isn't a partisan critique. It's just that it happens that one party is pushing this with this idea among Republicans who insist they're trying to, get into the public education system and say, you cannot any longer, we're going to pass laws at the state level, or if we have to at the national level, that say you cannot teach in public schools receiving public funding, okay, any interpretation of history that is critical of the place of the United States, and that, for example, the notion of critical race theory, for example, critical race theory has all kinds of problems with it. There's no question about that. You know what else has all kinds of problems with it? America First. You know what else has all kinds of problems with it? Flag waving without thinking. And yet, if you substitute one for the other, there's one thing we know you're not: liberal. But liberal in the sense of a classic Lockean liberal who says, look, these are personal decisions that have to be made by people. Okay. Now, there are a lot of problems with liberalism. There are a lot of problems with the liberal assumptions of tolerance. Okay. But the fact is, if you're talking about liberalism, you got to be talking about tolerance. And if you're saying no to any way other than yours, whatever else you are not liberal. And it's hard for me to think of any devoutly religious people who are not saying no. That got a double negative in there, but I think you know what I mean. In other words, what religion, consolidated as power, is looking at its adversaries, first of all, framing them as adversaries, heretics, non-believers, not only, I mean, you can even be a Muslim, but the wrong kind of Muslim, or you could be a Christian, but the wrong kind of Christian. Look at the violence that was visited upon Irish Catholics in the Northeast. I mean, people forget conveniently that there was a period of time when, in Boston or in New York or places like that, before the Irish organized and began to take over city machines, where you could be lynched for being Irish because you were part of the Roman peril. Okay. That's a lot of things, okay, but it's not tolerant and it's not liberal. And I think that's where the notion of liberalism got lost in the article. Karen tried to kind of excavate it and resurrect it, but it's kind of like what we were talking about in the Juergensmeyer article. They didn't give you a lot to work with. I think it's an interesting article because I think it stimulates interesting discussions. But I do think, not unlike the Juergensmeyer article, it kind of swallows its own tail. It doesn't help us that much. Yeah, Pamela?
I felt that it was just highlighting things that were deemed socially progressive and interchangeably linking that with being like tolerant liberal.
Because they're not the same thing.
They're not, exactly. Right. But they
were. A liberal could conceivably not be what social justice warriors consider to be progressive. A liberal essentially, in terms of the prevailing political perspectives in the world, liberals are kind of in the moderate center. The American notion of a liberal, oddly enough, is really Joe Biden. He's a liberal in the sense that he's a centrist. He's worried about excessive state intervention, but he has also that liberal belief in the perfectibility of people, that you can make society better by taking, positive actions, that you don't just accept society the way it is and say, well, this is the way God made it, or this is the way, this is the natural hierarchy. The thing about liberalism is it sort of assaults that notion of natural hierarchy because it so firmly situates power in the individual. Okay. And a philosophy that situates power in the individual has to espouse individual freedom. Freedom requires tolerance. And so, yeah, you're right. It's not what's progressive. It's what's free. Because freedom is high risk. Okay. And a progressive regime that controls everything and says, okay, now you can have that, transsexual surgery or whatever. They're not trying to be progressive. They're just engineering society in an oppressive way. That's not tolerance, necessarily. It isn't. I mean, who's really going to argue that the current Iranian regime is tolerant? I mean, I don't even think the current American regime is that tolerant, but Iran, I think not. Russia, I think not. You know, I mean, that's a Paleolithic regime in Russia. I mean, that's a regime that seems to want to go back 150 years. You know, what it's not is liberal. Now, again, it doesn't have to be. There's nothing wrong intrinsically with being traditionalist or conservative or anything else. But if you're talking about liberalism, you're not talking about the flavor of the day in terms of progressive fantasy or whatever. You're talking about fundamental commitment to difference, to freedom, to noise, you know. And I don't see that in this article, you know. So that was the subtlety of it. Karen, you nailed it, no problem. Are there any other observations there? I feel like I kind of commandeered it, but on the other hand, I want to make sure that you got that because I think it's an important point. We misuse the term liberal just like we misuse the term religion, just like we misuse the term Islam all the time. And we don't know what we're talking about too often. As not us, your group, but Americans. We stumble over our own tongues on these things, you know. All right. I thought this was a useful discussion. I thought we got a lot done. Is there any undue pressure on anyone to get this paper written by next Wednesday? That gives you a week. Okay. And remember, if you want to do like, okay, here's an introductory paragraph, or here's a little bit of a paragraph and an outline or something. You want to email that to me and let me respond to it. That's totally fine. If you want to meet via Zoom, your office hour, or schedule another time, that's totally fine. Okay. I don't want you to feel like you're on your own completely. Ultimately, yeah, it's your own work, but I mean, you know, I don't care. I get paid for it. It's fun. All right. Anything else? All right, then, in addition to the assignment, though, I would like you to just kind of take a peek ahead at the articles coming up in Module 4. I don't expect you to read them until after you've written your paper, because I want that to be your best work. But certainly by this time next week, you should have at least taken a look at the four articles. Okay. Anything else? All right. Then well in advance of it, I will ask you please to have a good weekend and come back for a fresh next week. Okay?
Thank you.